What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGOFrom0 back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and in this video I'm going to be going over the recent results of the latest Chaos tournament that we held on the YGOFrom0 Discord server. Now, we hold these sort of retro tournaments every month, so if you want to participate in the next one, head on over to the Discord, link in the description of the video. But it's a great place to find games in any of the formats that I feature on the channel and play in these tournaments, and the tournaments are always a blast. This Chaos tournament was no exception, as, we saw some very interesting gameplay, very interesting decks, and so let's talk about it. Now, of course, since this is Chaos format, which is commonly considered a Tier 0 format, there is going to be, in terms of deck type representation, one deck that dominates, and that is Chaos. Now, I'm using these sort of pie charts made by Format Library, and I will have a link to their coverage in the description of the video as well if you want to sort of look into this stuff in more detail. Basically, there were 40 players in the tournament. 29 of them brought what is categorized as Chaos Control, and an additional 2 brought what is categorized as Chaos Warrior. Now, the line between Chaos Warrior and Chaos Control is kind of thin, as you may see in my coverage of the decks themselves in the top 8. You could potentially lump those together to say 31 people brought some form of chaos. And, 3/4 of the pool bring one deck. That is pretty much the standard definition of a Tier 0 format. That being said, the format is still very fun, and I do think that building the optimal chaos builds is still sort of an open question, and people are still experimenting with it. But as I mentioned, 29 people brought Chaos Control, 2 brought Chaos Warrior, and then there were a variety of other decks that were brought as well. 2 brought Stall Burn, 2 brought Scientist FDK, and then 1 player each brought Jar Turbo, Gravekeeper, Reasoning Gate Turbo, and there's no gate in it, so it's really just Reasoning Turbo, Gren Maju Turbo, and Paladin Turbo. So, as I mentioned, pretty homogenous, deck type representation there. But for the deck category, it's the same sort of thing. Now, I'm not really like a big fan of deck categorization. I feel like, especially in these old formats, decks can do different things at different times. But there are some decks that stand out as being more aggro-based or combo-based, etc. But as you see here, most of the decks were categorized as control because this is a control-heavy format. Even though it can have its aggressive pushes and explosive plays, I do think that, the games in this more closely resemble more typical control games than typical aggro games or things like that. So, if you like control games, then I do think this format is one to check out. And if you want to see some gameplay, check out the stream I did of the finals match of this tournament just the other day. It's a great stream, great gameplay, great commentary, so definitely check it out. But now that I've covered the sort of overview of the deck types and categories, let's dive into the top 8 deck lists themselves, as I think there were some interesting things in them. First up, we've got Ellie Tin Can's topping Chaos Control list, and, this is pretty standard. I'm really not going to go through too much of the individual card by cards here for each deck. I will just mention, specific things that I noticed. For instance, the lights in each deck are very important to talk about, as, there are plenty of good darks in this format, things like Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, which is Black Forest, Sangan, etc. But the lights are always a bit tougher to figure out. So I do think that noticing what lights each of these Chaos players are on is important, as there are varying different philosophies for what your ratios of lights should be. Ellie Tin Can here is on double DD Warrior Lady, double Shining Angel, and a Magician of Faith, in addition to the BLS, of course. But, you generally don't want to use BLS as a light engrave. There are situations where you do, but in general, you want to have it to use. Some other things to note here, Ellie is playing a Magical Scientist. Magical Scientist is a card that I've seen in some main decks, not in other main decks. I personally am sort of souring on this card a little bit in this format. It can be very strong, but if you don't have the protection for it, then you're paying a lot of life points to basically remove like 1 or 2 problematic cards and leaving yourself open for more damage next turn. So I'm not the hugest fan of this card, but it is something that's good to know about. Interestingly enough, in their extra deck, they are playing Magical Scientist. They're actually not playing Guilty of the D-Knight. Now, in this format, the fusion deck is unlimited, so, you can sort of like proxy in whatever fusion monster you might need. But Guilty is a good one to know about if you get Scientist up, as it is a light target, so that can come up occasionally. Also, important thing to note, Jinzo here is in the main deck. Now, Jinzo is a card that's been cut from a lot of main decks because tribute monsters are a bit slow, and you often can't afford to play them as they are a bit bricky as well. But Ellie is rocking the Jinzo here, and that did bring them to top 8, so maybe something to experiment with in the future. They're also playing a Premature Burial. Premature Burial is another card that occasionally sees played in the decks, occasionally sees play not in the main deck, because, you know, it can be stopped by one of the Mystical Space Typhoons that everyone's playing. It can be stopped by Imperial Order, so it's a bit iffy of a card, I think, but, you know, they are playing it in addition to the Call of the Haunted as well. So 3 rival cards here, which makes sense in a format where you've got these very, very powerful boss monsters. But that's going to do it for Ellie's list. I mean, the side deck here is worth noting as well, but I think a lot of people's side decks in this tournament were sort of haphazard and just sort of trying to experiment with, like, what cards you might want to see, what cards you might not want to. So I'm not really going to go over these side decks too much. Next up, we've got Dump Truck's Chaos Control list, and as you see, you know, it's pretty similar, although there are some key differences. Firstly, checking out the lights, we got triple DD Warrior and triple Thunder Dragon instead of Shining Angels. Now, I myself have sort of, you know, shifted away from liking Thunder Dragon to liking Shining Angel, just because Shining Angel can actually do things immediately, but Thunder Dragon does have its benefits as well. It deck thins for you to make it easier to draw into your Chaos monsters. It's also a great pitch off of Graceful Charity, insulates you from something like Delinquent Duo, and also you can sort of just discard it at will, because Fail to Find is a thing in this format, to sort of modulate the amount of lights in your graveyard at a moment's notice. So Thunder Dragon does have its advantage over Shining Angel, as well as its cons. So, you know, it's cool to see another sort of approach to this Chaos Light lineup. For the Darks, also, I want to mention double Gravekeeper Spy here. Gravekeeper Spy is a card that's seen a lot of experimentation in this format as of late, and I think it's a very, very powerful card. Really annoying for your opponent to get over, and also brings out another Dark from your deck. Deck thins a little bit, so I do like this card a lot, although playing 2 copies, you know, can potentially brick if you draw both of them. Also, you know, double Magician of Faith here to add to the light count. Magician of Faith, very, very powerful card this format, and a light that a lot of people opted to play. Dump Truck, just like Ellie Tin Can, is playing the Premature Burial here. So, you know, another top 8 deck list playing this card, maybe a sign that this card should be played more in this format. Also, a Raigeki Break being played in the main deck, very interesting. Pairs with Sinister Serpent, lets you discard a light to graveyard potentially, and is good removal. So, another card to potentially experiment with in the future. And, you know, I want to note, unlike Ellie's list, there's no Magical Scientist here. So, you know, that's also something to keep in mind. As I mentioned, Magical Scientist is not played in every deck. Same with Jinzo, not Jinzo in here. Also, no Fiber Jar in the main deck. A lot of people side the Fiber Jar. Dump Truck has chosen not to even side the Fiber Jar. But Fiber Jar is a very strong card, so that'll be an interesting card to watch in these deck lists as well. Moving on to the next Chaos Control list, we've got Jazz's list here, and for the lights, it's double DD Warrior Lady, double Shining Angel, and double Magician of Faith. So very similar to Ellie Tin Can's ratio of lights. Jazz is also playing the double Gravekeeper Spy that Dump Truck was playing as well. So you can start to see, like, a lot of players were thinking along similar lines and adjusting ratios based on that. And it's cool to see where they differ in terms of different ratios. You know, just like Dump Truck, Jazz is not playing Fiber Jar in the main deck, also not in the side deck as well. So that's kind of interesting to see here. Also, Jazz on double Nobleman of Crossout in the main, just hits those very powerful sets like Magician of Faith. Also prevents a light or dark from getting to graveyard, so that's very good as well, and can let you get a lot more aggressive. So I think Nobleman of Crossout is a very interesting inclusion in the main deck here. Also, no Premature Burial. You know, as I mentioned, not everyone's playing it, and Jazz was not playing it, and I happen to sort of agree with that philosophy. I think Premature Burial can be stopped by too many things and a little bit too bricky. But, you know, as the other decks show, you know, it is a card to experiment with as well. Also, this trap lineup looks really clean. Double Torrential Tribute is a ratio that appears in a lot of these topping deck lists here. And, you know, Torrential Tribute is at 3 copies, but if you play too much of it, it can feel a little bit bricky. So it makes sense why it's only at 2 here in this deck. Another interesting thing to note, Jazz not playing Injection Fairy Lily at all. Injection Fairy Lily, a very powerful search off of like Sanguinary Witch that can get in for 3,400 damage if you needed to. But, you know, it is an Earth card, so potentially not pairing as well with your Chaos monsters. So I have seen debate in this format as to whether you want to even play Lily at all. Same with Exiled Force, although Exiled Force is a more easy card to cut, as, you know, it's a bit slower, doesn't do as much. But Lily can deal a ton of damage all at once, and can potentially win you the game in certain situations. So I do think Lily is an interesting card to see how people experiment with it in the future. But, you know, other than that, I'm glad that Jazz is actually playing Guilty the D-Knight in the extra deck, even though they actually aren't playing Scientists. So again, no Scientists seeing play, no Jinzo seeing play. So it's interesting to see how these topping lists differ from each other, even though they are so similar. Lastly, for the last of the 5th place lists, we've got Helios Trident's Chaos Control list here as well. And arguably, you could classify this as Chaos Warrior. And this is why I mentioned earlier that the distinction between Chaos Warrior and Chaos Control is a very fine line. We see the Helios Trident is on double reinforcement in the army in the main deck, as well as the DD Warrior Ladies Exiled Forest package there. So, you could classify this as Chaos Warrior because it is playing Reinforced in the army, but this was classified as Chaos Control, and we'll see a Chaos Warrior list later on in this discussion and discuss, what exactly makes that Chaos Warrior versus Control. But I think that sort of line, again, is very, very thin, and you could classify this as Chaos Control, Chaos Warrior, either one. And I think that applies to the Chaos Warrior list as well. But this is a very, very interesting deck. Instead of just playing the BLS and the CED, they're also playing a Chaos Sorcerer as well, going in for the 3rd Chaos Monster. And apparently it seemed to have served them well here. Because they are playing 3 Chaos Monsters, it makes sense that they're also playing the Thunder Dragons to get more light in grave for these monsters. They're also playing triple DD Warrior Lady, which makes sense given the reinforcement in the army as well. Triple Kaiku as well to just punish your opponent's chaos strategies. Kaiku is a very, very powerful card in this format and maybe deserves to be mained at 3 copies in every sort of chaos deck because it is just so powerful at shutting off your opponent's chaos plays. Also, I want to note the Yata here. Not many people are playing Yata in the main anymore because the sort of Chaos Yata Lock has been shown to be very inconsistent and very hard to pull off. And Yata, when you don't have setup for it, can be a bit of a brick. But Helios Trident here is choosing to play it, and I'm curious to see if it actually came up for them in the tournament at all. But very interesting inclusion here. They're also playing a Heavy Storm, which is a card that not many people actually main, especially over an MST, because MST is very powerful at shutting off things like Imperial Order, shutting off your own Mirage of Nightmare, etc. So MST is a card that's usually mained to 3 copies, but you'll also notice the Helios Trident is not maining Mirage of Nightmare as well. So if you're not maining Mirage of Nightmare, you can afford to just cut down the Mystical Space into 2 copies. They are indeed playing Premature Burial as well, like some of the other lists were, but they're not playing Call of the Haunted, which is also a very interesting choice. I feel like personally I would play Call of the Haunted over Premature Burial, but Premature Burial does let them get a little bit more aggressive. They don't have to set it, they can activate it right away. And if they're playing like Heavy or Harpies, I guess they can clear out or bait out their opponent's Imperial Orders or MSTs of their own. So I can see the logic behind playing the Premature Burial here. They're also playing triple Raigeki Break. This pairs well with the Thunder Dragons, also can set up lights and darks in grave if they need to. But they're not playing Sinister Serpent in the main, which is kind of wild considering Serpent pairs very, very well with Raigeki Break. I guess, just like Injection Fairy Lily, it's not a dark or light, so it doesn't really pair with the chaos typing as much, but it still is very interesting to see these triple Raigeki Break and no Serpent in the deck. But very, very interesting list here. This is probably the most different of the Chaos Control lists in the top cut, and it does show that you can sort of have a lot of flexibility in how you build this deck. And this is why the discussion of, what the optimal sort of Chaos Control list is still going on, because there are a lot of different things to consider, which lights you're playing, which non-lights and darks you're playing, etc. And so it's very interesting to see as these tournaments continue to go on, how these sort of metagame around these top decks will sort of shift. Okay, here's the Chaos Warrior list that I was mentioning earlier, and this was piloted by Yomberman. And I can kind of see why this is called Chaos Warrior and the other decks weren't. It's playing the double reinforcement of the army, just like the last list I showed, but it's also playing Don Zalug and Zabire the Dark, in addition to the DD Warrior Ladies and the Exiled Force. So going up to 6 warriors here as opposed to just 4, it makes sense why this would be called Chaos Warrior instead of Chaos Control. But I do think that, again, the line is very fine, right? Like, you could just argue that these are more darks for your chaos typings and just say that this is a regular chaos deck playing the reinforcement in the army. You could have looked at the previous list and said, well, it's playing reinforcement in the army, that makes it Chaos Warrior. So I do think the line is very, very sort of fine there. But beyond these sort of additional warriors here, I want to mention some interesting techs as well. For instance, the Reflect Bounder, speaking of light that people are trying to play, this is a 1700 light monster, so it's a little bit of a beat stick on a light. And it can burn your opponent as well. And in a format with CED, that burn can potentially come up. So this is kind of an interesting card to experiment with. And apparently it looks like it did decently well for Yomberman here. Also, the Nobleman of Crossouts in the main deck, just like Jazz had. For a deck like this, it makes sense to get a little bit more aggressive, even if you can't necessarily go aggressive with something like Zimbira. If you can knock your opponent's set and then get in for a Don Zaluk hit, that can be very, very good. So that makes sense why Knock is in this deck as well. Premature Burial, again, seeing play here in this main deck. And it makes sense in a more aggressive deck like this. You want to be able to bring back something like a Don Tolu, get in for a hand rip. Also, triple Solemn Judgment in the main deck. Solemn is a card that's not really played as much in this format, given that, you know, you've got so many powerful cards in the format. That oftentimes it's hard to use this profitably. In addition, like Chaos Ember Dragon can just come down after you use a Solemn and end the game immediately now that your life points are very low. So, you know, Solemn is a card that hasn't really seen much play in the past, but it did manage to get Yammerman tied for 3rd place in this tournament. So a very interesting card to see. I also want to mention the triple trap Dust Shoots in the side. I think Jazz might have also had triple trap Dust Shoots in the side, but I didn't mention them when covering his deck list. But this is very, very good at, you know, if you're going first, you can bring these in, just completely annihilate your opponent's hand, and that can be very, very powerful. Also shuffles back into the deck, so it's preventing your opponent from getting more monsters engraved for Chaos setups, so that's very, very good as well. So very interesting list here, very sick list, and very different from a lot of the other lists in Top Cut here. Lastly, for the semifinalists, we've got Cosmo with another Chaos Control list. Although, again, you know, this list is playing Zimbira, it's playing Exiled Force, in addition to the triple Warrior lead. So, you know, did that count as a Warrior list? I mean, it's not playing Rhoda, so I wouldn't necessarily count it as a Warrior list, but these are just important things to keep in mind when you see classifications in a format like this. Oftentimes, you know, it's much more nebulous than it might seem. But for the lights, you know, triple DD Warrior Lady, double Magician of Faith. I think that's, you know, a pretty good lineup of lights there. No Shining Angels, though, to fetch out the Warrior Leads, which is kind of interesting, as Shining Angel is a light that a lot of people are playing. The double DD, not DD Warley, the double Graveyard Spy here to get out more darks, as we've seen in these past deck lists here. Zimbira the Dark is a dark, also can get over Graveyard Spy. It's a very interesting card to experiment with here as well. But beyond that, you know, there isn't too much different from what we've seen in the other deck lists here. A Sakuretsu Armor in the main is very interesting, though. People aren't really expecting Sakuretsu Armor because there are so many other powerful cards in this format. So generally, if like you use up Mirror Force, then your opponent will stop playing around Battle Traps, because the only other Battle Trap is really Sakuretsu Armor. I mean, Ring of Destruction does exist in this format as well, but it kind of doesn't feel like a Battle Trap, because a lot of the time, like, you know, you're taking the damage from the attack anyways. So, but, you know, Sakuretsu Armor, very interesting inclusion here, especially over a second Torrential Tribute, as a lot of people prefer Torrential Tribute to Sakuretsu Armor. But, you know, Cosmo rocking that Saku in the main, and it seems to have worked out pretty decently for them. So, you know, again, not really too much to talk about here compared to the other Chaos lists. But I hope that these lists are all showing you like how much variation there can be, even in a format that's called like Tier 0, like this one, because there are many different ways to build the sort of standard deck, and it's by no means solved. Like, there's still a lot of debate over which cards should be in and out, in the main and the side. So very, very cool to see that. But now we're diving in to the top 2 players here. We're beginning with the second place list piloted by Snack, and this list also has some very interesting innovations here. So for the light count, of course, we got the triple DD Warley, double Shining Angel, as we've seen in a lot of other decks in the past. But the interesting thing about this deck is the Morphing Jar here. Now, Morphing Jar, very, very interesting flip monster, very powerful flip monster. It says both players discard as many cards as possible from their hand, then each player draws 5 cards. This can allow you to cycle through your power cards, can allow you to get light and darks and gray for your chaos setups. And it's just a very, very interesting card in general. And it's a card that not as many people are experimenting with in the main deck in these Chaos lists. And I do think it's one to potentially consider experimenting with more in the future, as it seems to have worked out pretty well for Snack here, as they managed to get to second place piloting this list. Also, the Injection Fairy Lily is in the main deck here as a search that can deal 3,400 damage out of nowhere. So, you know, very powerful card, although not everyone is playing it. So it's interesting to see it here in this list. Also, no Sinister Serpent in the main. You know, I've mentioned this for some other lists as well, but I can kind of see why Sinister Serpent isn't the main deck here, as it is kind of underwhelming. It compared very well with Tri-Infecting Virus and Morphing Jar, but, you know, like, it doesn't really do much on its own, so it is an interesting card to sort of experiment with cutting here, and seems to have worked out well for Snack. Now, they are playing the Premature Burial as well, As I mentioned, not everyone is playing it, but Snack is playing it. It makes sense with the Morphing Jar. It can lead to some pretty crazy setups. Also, Magical Scientist is in the main deck here. We've seen it sort of cut from other main decks, but Magical Scientist can potentially come up in different game states. So, definitely a card to continue experimenting with in the future, as it seemed to have worked out well for Snack here, although I'm not the biggest fan of this card myself. But beyond that, there isn't too much to talk about here. I just think it's cool to continue seeing new tech in these topping lists that weren't in any of the others, even this far into the video. But of course, every tournament has to have a winner, and in this tournament, Aratos won. And Aratos is a very, very good duelist in all these retro formats. I mean, if you've watched my other tournament breakdowns, they appear in the top 8 a lot of the time. And this time is no exception. Now, for the light lineup, pretty standard stuff from what we've seen. Triple DD Warley, only one Shining Angel, though. But it seems to have worked out for them either way here. The monster lineup, the double Grief to your Spies here, as we've seen in other lists as well. Oh, also Magician of Faith for the light lineup as well, which we've also seen. Also, they are playing the Injection Fairy Lily, too. So, people are cutting Lily, but the top 2 decks did play Lily, so that's maybe a sign that Lily should be played more in the main deck. But, there's still definitely debate over whether that should be the case or not. Fiber Jar is also played in the main. A lot of people choose to side Fiber Jar and then bring it in going second. But Fiber Jar is a very, very good card, very powerful card that you can use to your advantage in a lot of different cases. So it definitely is an interesting card to see here in the main, but I understand why it is here. Also, the Sinister Serpent is in the deck as well. But, the real spicy tech in this list is the one Time Seal in the main deck. And Time Seal is actually a very, very interesting inclusion based on how it interacts with some very powerful cards in this format, namely Fiber Jar and CED. Fiber Jar and CED basically both have a similar sort of effect to sort of wipe the board clean and reset both players at, some game state, right? Like Fiber Jar resets the board basically to what it was like on the first turn, except for damage, and CED resets the board to basically a top deck war. Time Seal allows you to actually provide a lingering effect past those effects. So basically you prevent your opponent from drawing. And if you manage to CED them plus Time Seal them, even if you don't have the damage to exactly kill them with CED, that can put them in a really, really rough spot because they won't be able to draw the next turn. And then you can set up a play beyond that. And, speaking of this, maybe this is the way to sort of play the Chaos Yata Lock, because, if you've got Time Seal set, you can actually afford to bring out Witch, then Chaos Emperor Dragon, then search out the Yata, and then get in next turn with the Yata Lock. So definitely something to consider. Time Seal is not limited in this format, so it is playable at 3 copies. And, you could potentially pull off a sort of Yata Turbo deck with that sort of style. But I think that's probably a bit less consistent than this deck. It's just kind of something interesting to note. So, that basically does it for my coverage of these decks. I feel like I've talked about a lot of these choices here pretty extensively in the other lists in this video. And also I go through these lists, like these sorts of lists at least, very in depth in my other sort of Chaos videos, going through some gameplay as well. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and hopefully it encouraged you to dive into this format for yourself. As you can see, there's a lot of experimentation done in this top list, even though the format may be like tier 0. There's still a lot of work to be done, and any of the lists that I feature in this video are great starting points if you want to dive in for yourself. Just pick whichever one sort of suits your own taste the best. But that's going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed, as always, please do leave a like down below and also subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to support me directly, then you can sign up to my Patreon. If you do, you'll be able to be shouted out in these videos and also get exclusive perks like exclusive videos, suggesting video ideas, etc. And so big shout outs to my current patrons, GMYFS, Rincewind, Bren Donker, and Porkchop Coon. Thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. And it really motivates me to continue making these videos and continue exploring Yu-Gi-Oh's history with y'all. But that's going to do it for this video. Let me know what you think of these topping lists down below, and also what you think of Chaos format as a whole, and where do you think the format's going to go from here. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGOFrom0, and I'm signing off.